Welcome everyone to this month's ITA Clean Sport Education webinar. My name is Dylan Karach and I'm a member of the education team at the International Testing Agency. And I am delighted to present this month's topic on Ask the Expert Testing alongside our guest panelist Jack Pinnick-Gray, ITA Senior Testing Officer. Hi Jack and welcome to our webinar.
Hey Dylan, it's a pleasure to be here today and welcome and hello to everyone joining us.
Thank you, Jack, and you will come back very shortly, by the way. So for our audience today, to get the most out of today's webinar, we are offering simultaneous translation in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish, asking your opinion and testing your knowledge by using a poll, and your answers are anonymous. We are also answering your questions you submitted in the registration link, answering additional questions live at the end. So you can write them at any time in the session using the question button on your Zoom menu. So the earlier, the better. And finally, we are recording the session. So on to today's topic. And we will provide an overview of testing by starting with the following question. What is testing? So from the perspective of the World Anti-Doping Code and international standard for testing, testing is all part of the doping control process, involving test distribution planning, sample collection, sample handling, and sample transport. Importantly, the testing process is the same for every athlete in every sport, no matter where you are in the world. And today, we will give a high-level overview of the topic and then respond to the question you submitted through the registration form link. So it is very important as an athlete or athlete support personnel that you understand what doping is. So you are prepared, and we encourage you to think of testing like this. Doping control is a personal checkpoint on the road to greatness. So when you provide a blood or urine sample, it shows that you're achieving success through hard work and determination. And now maybe it's a good time to welcome Jack again. And maybe I have the following question for you, Jack. Who can be tested?
So all athletes who fall under the jurisdiction of an anti-doping organization and are subject to their anti-doping rules can be tested. An athlete can be tested any place at any time, both in competition, so usually immediately after they finish competing, and also out of competition. This could be at home, at training, or even perhaps when they're on holiday.
Thank you very much, Jack, for your first input. And maybe our audience now wonders which organization can test athletes for anti-doping purposes. And we have a poll question for our audience. And on the next slide, and with the poll, we have the question, who cannot test athletes? So who cannot test athletes? National anti-doping organizations, international federation, major event organizers, the International Testing Agency, or the World Health Organization. For now, Jack, I can tell you that there is one favorite. I won't tell you the result for now. Just keep you a few more
Keep me
seconds.
on my toes.
Correct. But for now, the top preference is the World Health Organization. A few others also selected major event organizers. Just leave a few more seconds. Okay, so let's close the poll and share the results with the audience. Jack, you can see the result from our audience. So maybe can you share the correct answer?
Indeed. So it's good to see the audience has got it correct. So the World Health Organization cannot test athletes. However, NADO, so National Anti-Doping Organizations, IFs, international federations, MEOs, so major events organizers, they can all test athletes, and addition, delegated third parties such as the ITA. So yeah, well done. Everyone got that one correct.
Correct. Yeah, we have a well-informed audience about this one. So thank you, Jack. Maybe at this point, let's mention and remind athletes' responsibilities during doping control. So here, what is to keep in mind is that athlete must report for testing immediately once notified, show a valid identification. So this can be passport, or if during a major event, an accreditation is accepted as identification, to remain in direct sight of the doping control officer, blood control officer, or chaperone at all times. And of course, comply with the sample collection procedure. So the doping control or the blood collection officer will instruct you step by step during this process. And alongside their responsibilities, it is as equally important, athletes, that you know your rights during doping control. So as an athlete, you have the right to have a representative with you, such as coach, team manager, or team doctor. Minors should be notified in the presence of a non-minor representative, and it is strongly recommended that they are accompanied by one throughout the sample collection session. And if a minor athlete declines the presence of a representative, this does not invalidate the test, but it should be clearly documented by the doping control officer. Athletes also have the right to request an interpreter for translation assistance. If needed, request the identification of the chaperone or the doping control officer. And you also have the right to ask any questions about the process to the doping control officer at any time. Athletes are also entitled to ask for special assistance or modification to the process. For example, to need a wheelchair in case of injury, to record any comments on the doping control form, and these have absolutely no effect on the outcome of the athlete test. And finally, athletes have a right to request a delay for valid reasons. But maybe, Jack, can you please elaborate a bit more of the valid reasons to ask for a delay?
Sure. So some of the valid reasons to request a delay can include attending a victory ceremony, finishing a training session, receiving medical attention, fulfilling a pre-arranged media commitment, or warming down after training or competing. Ultimately, the doping control officer decides if the request for a delay is valid, and the athlete will be continuously observed during the delay by their chaperone or doping control officer.
Great, thank you very much, Jack. So maybe also one thing to remind our audience is that any athlete can be tested at any time, at any place. So outside of competition, this includes at home, training, at work, school, or holiday, like what Jack mentioned. And for anti-doping organizations to be able to locate athletes for testing, some athletes are required to provide information known as whereabouts, so they can easily be found. These athletes are included in what is called a testing pool. And there are 3 types of testing pool. And maybe, Jack, can you share what those testing pools are?
Yes, of course. So Perfect. On the screen, you can see the three main types of testing pool. At the top, we have the registered testing pool, or RTP for short. This group has the highest whereabouts requirements with significant consequences for non-compliance. Next, you have the testing pool, or TP for short. This group has less whereabouts requirements than the RTP and lesser consequences for non-compliance. And finally, you have the other pools. This group has minimal whereabouts requirements. If you're included in any type of testing pool, you will receive an official letter of inclusion from an anti-doping organization. This will include all the information about what you need to do, including what to include and how to submit your whereabouts information.
And Jack, can you maybe elaborate a bit more about the whereabouts for our audience, as we received a few questions on whereabouts?
Sure. So as you mentioned, whereabouts is information provided by a limited number of elite athletes about their location. This information is provided in a form of quarterly filing failures and is uploaded on a secure platform that can only be accessed by authorized people acting on behalf of an anti-doping organization. All information about an athlete needs to do, all information about what an athlete needs to do is included in their official letter of inclusion.
Thank you, Jack, for your initial inputs, and let's maybe go to the submitted questions from the audience. So in the registration link, our audience had the opportunity to submit questions on today's topic, and we thank everyone who sent them in. And we received a lot of questions, so we have grouped them so we can address as many as possible. So anything outside the scope of testing, we will not answer today, but please look out for future webinar opportunities to ask experts on those topics in the upcoming months. So maybe the first question that we received, Jack, is what are the key principles of effective testing?
So for me, I would group it into kind of 5 sections. So the first one being risk-based and intelligence-led testing. So that's making sure we focus on the high-risk sports and subsequently the athletes within those sports. So using intelligence and kind of the information to influence our decision making. So whether that's performance analysis, biological passport data, or potentially tips from our intelligence departments. Another category would be, or another principle would be no advance notice. It's very important that athletes don't know when we're coming to test them. So we get them to provide whereabouts, which facilitates out of competition with no advance notice. It's also important that unannounced testing takes place because it ensures athletes cannot predict or evade testing. Another principle would be unpredictability. And that's why we do both out of competition and in competition testing. Surprise testing prevents athletes from planning a doping cycle, and it kind of it gives that element of unpredictability, which is important. International collaboration and information sharing, that would be another key principle. The ITA frequently works with national anti-doping agencies, and that collaboration and information sharing allows us to enhance both of our respective anti-doping programs. And finally, just continuously kind of adapting and improving our testing activities. If we spot any particular trends, we'll use that to kind of refine our test planning and how we distribute our testing.
Great, thank you, Jack. So yeah, what a great way to start. And yes, I mean, what you shared is also just to make sure that the process is the same for every athlete from every sport around the world. And you mentioned about international collaboration and the fact that the ITA is frequently in touch with NADOs. So how does the ITA coordinate with NADOs to enhance the effectiveness of testing program?
So we're frequently in touch with NADOs. The anti-doping space is a very well connected one, so the collaboration there is always very important. We're frequently touching base with them to kind of share who we're planning on testing, and that subsequently allows us to do kind of athlete gap analysis reviews where we can see, for example, say a team sport, if I know that a NADO is testing their national team very comprehensively, me as the international federation, I can focus my efforts on another team that maybe isn't being covered as comprehensively. So it allows us to, that sharing of information allows us to really kind of efficiently distribute our testing. We often share who's on our respective testing pools, so whether that's the RTP or TP. If we ever have any suspicious information, we're happy to kind of collaborate on that and work together to try and catch athletes we believe might be doping. Additionally, athletes nowadays are frequently traveling across the globe and based overseas for large periods of time. So if us, maybe as the International Federation, have better resources and ability to access an athlete who isn't in their home nation, then we work with NADOs to facilitate testing all over the globe. Additionally, we might work with a national anti-doping agency and use their doping control officers to conduct a test for a partner of the ITA, for example.
Great, thank you, Jack. And yeah, usually our audience for monthly webinars, we have many people working in a NADO, so that's why we also thank all the NADOs represented today for being with us. Maybe for the last question from this slide, Jack, is that someone asked, what is the biggest challenge in testing? What can you say about that?
Tricky one. There's quite a few challenges, but if I had to kind of select one, I would start by saying that globally, as sports become increasingly accessible for athletes, the number of athletes who are under the jurisdiction of anti-doping rules continues to grow. So us as an anti-doping organization, we really have a tricky challenge of deciding how we focus our testing efforts. And I guess prioritization would be the key word here, where we have to focus our efforts based on a risk-based testing program that identifies kind of which sports and subsequently which athletes are the highest risk kind of group and how kind of, and that in general is a big challenge. We don't necessarily, obviously we've got our suspicions, but we can't see into future. We don't have this kind of crystal ball. So prioritization based on risk is key. And we've touched upon NADOs already. It's also why we work closely with the anti-doping community to make sure that this big pool of athletes is well covered, and collectively we've got great coverage to ensure kind of efficient and effective testing.
Great, thank you, Jack. So I guess that was to set the scene with those first three questions, because we will have a few more questions that are very more specific. And the first one is about sample collection and analysis. So we had what is dried blood spot testing and when it is used?
So dried blood spot testing. So a small amount of blood is captured from the athlete's blood vessels in their skin rather than their vein. It's then kind of blotted and onto dried paper. That sample is then shipped to a WADA accredited laboratory for analysis. It's used in the same way as a traditional blood test is used, so both out of competition and in competition testing. It's typically collected at the same time as a urine sample. You can actually see on the screen here, there are two main kind of types of DBS testing kit that are being used at the moment. You have one, which is the one just on the left, which is collecting a blood sample from your upper arm, whereas the one just on the right is from your finger. So both are used and are both kind of fully approved and WADA accredited, so an athlete could experience both. DBS testing is an exciting area with kind of potential to advance anti-doping. It's less invasive on the athlete. Only a small amount of blood needs to be withdrawn. We're not needing to kind of puncture the athlete's skin to get to a vein, and therefore there's less discomfort for the athlete. We could collect blood samples for more athletes. It's typically quite a cost-effective sample collection technique, partly because it's easier to transport and store. Your traditional blood sample requires refrigeration, and there's strict requirements around that, whereas a DBS sample, refrigeration isn't needed, which ultimately makes it cheaper and logistically easier. At the moment, DBS testing only has a limited analysis menu at the laboratories. And in fact, some laboratories are not yet able to analyze it. However, there's a lot of kind of growth in this area, and we anticipate more and more opportunities in the future. However, for now, it won't be replacing your traditional kind of urine and venous blood testing. It's for the moment more complementary, but it's an exciting area, and who knows, in the future it might be used for a lot more, and it's definitely an area for development.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. An additional tool for you to test athletes, but yeah, it doesn't replace the traditional testing such as urine and blood.
Exactly.
So when planning testing, how do you decide which type of sample to collect? Urine, venous blood, or as we touch upon DBS?
So the mentioned kind of sample types all have their kind of strengths. So, for example, not all prohibited substances can be detected in urine. Not all of them can be detected in blood. For example, urine is good for detecting anabolic steroids and stimulants, whereas kind of blood from the vein is very good at detecting blood doping, human growth hormone, and biological passport markers. Dry blood spot testing is showing some great kind of proving to be good at detecting EPO and certain anabolic steroids. So yeah, that's always a consideration, is the different detection strengths. You also have to consider the athlete's sport and doping risk. I'll give you a quick example. For example, in endurance sports, like say a cycling or a cross-country skiing, there is a higher risk of blood doping, and therefore kind of venous blood samples would make sense. And you can use that to track biological passport markers. However, take archery, that it wouldn't make sense necessarily to have the same strategy as cycling and cross-country skiing. I guess other aspects, we touched upon it briefly already, but cost. The different samples come with kind of different associated costs, and that's often linked to the collection and shipping. As briefly mentioned, kind of the traditional blood sample that comes from a vein, you have to keep it refrigerated, and that comes with extra cost and logistical challenges. In addition to that, the more traditional blood sample requires a phlebotomist to collect the sample, which obviously sourcing phlebotomists, it's an extra member of staff that can kind of be an additional factor. And finally, we're always mindful of the athlete's well-being, and that's something to always consider. As mentioned, a DBS test is much more athlete-friendly, and as is a urine test. So that's something to consider as well for an anti-doping organization.
Correct. Yeah, it seems a very thorough test planning to do.
For sure.
And maybe so the next question that we have is that who is actually responsible for recruiting chaperones for testing missions?
Yeah, so we have what's called in the anti-doping space called a sample collection agency. So it would be their responsibility. They could be your national anti-doping agency. They could also be a private sample collection agency. And it would be their responsibility to recruit and train chaperones. You could also have a scenario where at certain competitions, the athletes are volunteers, and there may be a collaboration with the local organizing committee to recruit those chaperones. However, in all cases, chaperones have to go through training in line with the international standard for testing. And they have to make there's set criteria that a chaperone has to meet. For example, they can't be a minor, they have to be 18 and over. They also have strict conflict of interest requirements that they can't be in breach of. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Jack. And let's maybe end with, we have one question about integrity. And so it was about how integrity is maintained during doping control process to ensure that athletes do not cheat. Maybe can you elaborate a bit more on that part?
For sure. So integrity is critical in anti-doping. And there's lots of kind of formal documents, whether that be in the World Anti-Doping Code or the various international standards that are in place to ensure anti-doping organizations act in an integral manner. I guess if I was to list a few different aspects, we've got strict athlete identification and notification. So we always make sure that the athlete provides a valid identification. They're always being chaperoned or supervised by a chaperone or doping control officer. Within the sample collection process, we always make sure that the doping control officers or doping control personnel are trained. There's always that direct observation. The testing kit that's used is always tamper-proof, which is a key principle for integrity. You also have aspects such as sample security in the chain of custody. For example, when a sample is collected from an athlete, it's documented through every step of the process until it reaches the laboratory. There's always a detailed paper trail. And similar to the kit, there's tamper-proof kind of transportation kit as well that goes with the samples. We've got independent laboratories that analyze the samples. They all have to follow strict WADA accreditation rules. And the laboratories never know who the sample belongs to. It's always anonymous, and the athlete's identity isn't known by the person analyzing the sample. We also have aspects such as athlete whereabouts and unannounced testing. And finally, which is critical, is there's sanctions for people that are cheating. And yeah, collectively, all of those aspects really cover the integrity side of things and make sure it's maintained in the doping control process.
Great, thank you, Jad. So yeah, maintaining integrity is very essential. And then this is where we have the frameworks such as the World Anti-Doping Code and international standards to make sure that integrity is maintained during doping control process. Very quickly, so for the question, do analysis capabilities differ between laboratories, and do you plan for this?
So yes, they do differ. Some WADA accredited laboratories have additional expertise in detecting specific substances. And yes, again, the ITA does consider the differences. And we, especially in the testing department, we will strategically select laboratories for their expertise and analysis menu. So yes, it is something we consider, and it is very much kind of relevant to testing strategy.
Right, thank you, Jack. And today we also have athletes joining us. So maybe for the athletes, can an athlete refuse to be tested?
No, would be the short answer. An athlete cannot refuse anti-doping testing. If they do, they will face anti-doping rule violation 2.3, which is refusing, evading, or failing to comply with sample collection. And this can result in up to a 4-year ban for a first offence. Athletes should always comply. And our recommendation is, even if you have concerns, comply with the test and address the issues afterwards through the proper channels, whether that's kind of conducting through the paperwork, contacting your national anti-doping agency or the relevant anti-doping organization. So yeah, take it through the proper channels, but we don't recommend you risk a potential ban through refusing.
Great, thank you, Jack. And so a few minutes ago, we also introduced about whereabout and testing pool, and we received one question about the selection criteria for inclusion in the registered testing pool. Can you help the audience in that question?
Of course. So the ITA testing department factors in lots of different kind of aspects when they're selecting an athlete for the registered testing pool. I guess I'll go through some of the key considerations. Anti-doping testing history. So we'll look at who's been tested and who hasn't, and that will influence our decision. We look at the performance level of the different athletes. So how well they did in the previous season. And again, that factors our decision. We look at the country's risk. So anti-doping organizations often give a kind of a scoring to different countries based on the previous ADRV kind of history. And in addition, the corruption index for that specific country. Additionally, if we have any suspicion on an athlete that they might be doping, that would potentially increase the chances of them being added to the RTP, and we would factor that in. For example, if my colleagues in our science and medical department or internal investigations team share with me some information about an athlete's athlete biological passport data or maybe a tip that the I&I team have received, that again would influence our decisions. And finally, we've touched upon NADO collaboration already, but that's another key aspect here. We don't want to necessarily overcomplicate it and have one athlete being on both the registered testing pool of their NADO and the International Federation. So the International Testing Agency and NADOs communicate a lot, and we will discuss who's on each program. And we do that to kind of make it easier for the athlete, but also avoid an overlap in testing and where maybe initially we were considering the same athlete, we can now pick up two athletes and the scope is larger.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Jack. So yeah, many considerations. And is there a maximum number of times an athlete can update their whereabouts?
So no, there isn't. There is no official maximum limit. An athlete providing whereabouts, they're required to keep their whereabouts information accurate and up to date at all times, and are encouraged to submit updates as often as needed. Athletes must update as soon as they become aware of a change in their schedule. Changes must be made in advance. Last minute changes are allowed if they are truly last minute changes. And importantly, patterns of last minute updates will be investigated and may be considered suspicious depending on the circumstances. So yeah, the short answer is no, but there's a lot of kind of case by case kind of things to consider there as well.
Right, thank you, Jack. And maybe just for our audience, you will receive the presentation slides after the live session, and we also included a link to our Adams and whereabouts quick reference cards. So for all the athletes, feel free to check out this resource, and we hope it will be helpful for you. And maybe, Jack, the last question that we have is more like a scenario one. So if an athlete in a team tests positive, what impact will this have on the team?
So there could be serious consequences for the team. It's typically case by case. So one aspect is the team results and potential disqualification, eligibility for future competitions. You've got the kind of more social side of things, such as financial and sponsorship consequences, and that ties into the kind of reputational damage. The extent of the impact really depends on the relevant sports rules and regulations, and additionally the number of athletes within a team that test positive. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. I couldn't agree more. I mean, even going beyond, it means that as a consequences, like the athletes lose also their community, and so doping also have a negative effect on an athlete's mental and social health as well. So before, Jack, you mentioned about collaboration between the ITA and NATOs, but we also received a question about how do testing and education cooperate at the ITA. So here it's more about, so the ITA ensures that athletes are well informed and about anti-doping regulations and the importance of clean sports, while also enforcing these standards through testing. For example, the education teams inform the testing team about any upcoming webinars and event-based education. And in turn, the testing team about any challenges that they face. So there's ongoing effort for collaboration between the testing and the education team are essential in order to inform future education initiative, for example, for athletes and their support personnel on specific topic of need. Maybe Jack, do you want to elaborate a bit more about the collaboration that we have with the testing team?
Yeah, sure. So for me at the ITA, I'm often communicating with the education department here. And the kind of information I share would be kind of trends and potential education gaps that I spot. For example, if in recent years a particular international federation is seeing a much younger age of athletes competing at the highest level and winning lots of medals, for example, they're all minors, then that would be useful information to share with the education department. They could then potentially do a tailored webinar or a tailored kind of approach to target minors and their entourage. Another example is potentially around whereabouts. In the testing department, we're frequently reviewing and looking at athletes' whereabouts for testing purposes. And if we were to spot a trend of maybe improper or poorly submitted whereabouts, then that as well is something that we may share with the education department, which they could then influence or factor into a future webinar.
Correct. So yeah, mutual collaboration, and yeah, that's what we always look forward to having your feedback to design future informed education activities. So maybe the next two questions I will tackle those, Jack. So about the question, is there any education for coaches on the doping control process? So maybe before thinking of training, so you as a coach, you are a key part of a clean sport, and you should assist and support your athletes that you work with in fulfilling their anti-doping responsibilities. So in terms of training, we recommend, for example, the WADA ADEL course for high performance coaches, and we have included a link to the WADA ADEL platform in the resource slide. And the ITA also have an athlete guide to testing available in 12 languages, which cover the key points of the testing process, which is also useful for coaches and other athlete support personnel. As you may have spotted, there is a QR code on screen, and we also have this guide linked in the resource slides. The last question, and then I will ask you your input, Jack. So, do you have any advice for athlete support personnel who are supporting an athlete with a disability during the doping control process? So, just to know, the International Paralympic Committee has published a useful doping control guide for testing athletes in para sports, and we have also linked this resource slide in the webinar. But Jack, do you have any input on that question?
Yeah, I can add a few bits. As you mentioned, that the IPC document would be a good starting point. I guess I can emphasize that the international standard for testing does have modifications in place during the sample collection process for athletes with a disability or an impairment. I guess for an ASP, you could be more involved in the doping control process if you're joining your athlete kind of during it. So just kind of obviously the document that the IPC has, but in general, anti-doping or knowledge of the testing process is always going to be useful. You could find yourself needing to potentially seal the sample on behalf of the athlete, depending on the athlete's kind of impairment. So yeah, having a good understanding, there's resources available out there. So yeah, that would be my advice. The IPC document's fantastic, so I definitely check that out.
Great, thank you, Jack. So yeah, have a look at the at this guide made by the International Paralympic Committee. So before we will jump to our live Q&A. We received many questions about ITA training programs for doping control officers, for example. And more information on these programs can be found by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen. And reminder that you will receive the presentation slides after the session ends. But here you can see that the ITA offers a few courses, whether it is for doping control officer, blood collection officer, or chaperone. And I'll just leave a few more seconds. So for anyone who is interested in joining one of the ITA courses, so you have time to save this QR code. But in the meantime, Jack, thank you for your input, for addressing the questions submitted by our audience in the registration link. So now maybe before we have the live Q&A, maybe you have seen that we received many questions in the Q&A. But before we jump in, let's maybe show you the resources that here on your screen, and we have included many useful links for you to consult after the live session. And I guess it's a good moment for us to tackle our live Q&A. Jack, you have seen that we received quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. So
Yes.
we will go one by one, and maybe the first one from Kyle David. Apologies if I pronounce incorrectly your question, but maybe Jack, I'll maybe summarize this Kai question for you. So in competition with mandatory testing, so the top 4 athletes are usually selected randomly by the anti-doping organization. What would happen if the anti-doping team doesn't show up? How long should an athlete wait before leaving?
So I guess I'm not familiar with every international federation's rules, and mandatory testing is often case by case depending on the sport. I guess one thing to quickly mention is top 4 being tested. That sounds like a very specific policy for a federation. I'm personally not aware of a federation that has that in place, but that could well be in place. But it sounds quite specific to a certain sport. If an anti-doping organization has within their rules a requirement for testing to take place, then first of all, I'd hope that testing is therefore planned and that they have put the proper process in place to kind of accommodate that requirement. There is no kind of need necessarily. I don't know. I guess if an athlete is if an athlete is 100% needing to be tested in line with their anti-doping rules and maybe for ratification of their record, for example, then often there is a time duration within that IF's rules. Obviously, this again could be case by case, so it's something to look into. But there might be a 24-hour window, for example, and therefore the athlete could reach out to their national anti-doping agency and trying to arrange something swiftly. I guess making sure that the athlete is 100% sure of the anti-doping rules. I guess perhaps in this specific case, maybe the first place to start is, I'm not aware of what sport this is questions relating to, but maybe reach out to your international federation, reach out to your NADO and try and get clarification, because it will be very specific to that sport. I believe, personally, I'm not aware of a sport that has something as specific as always the top 4 have to be tested. So that would be my starting point is if there are rules that require mandatory testing that aren't particularly clear in certain cases, then I would touch base with the NADO or International Federation. And maybe even if you can find a copy of the anti-doping rules, then give them a read as well.
Correct, thank you. And usually also the international federations, they put on their website their anti-doping
Exactly.
rules. So this is where, for example, for UK here and for our audience, feel free to consult your affiliated organization and consult the anti-doping rules of your international federation. So we also received a question from Minwoo, and maybe I will just read it for you, Jack. So as you know, in competition testing, there are always unexpected things happening. For example, testing in athletics, usually there are out of competition testing just before competition. But if the athletes were not on time, they could not get the out of competition test. And the testing coordinator, for example, decided to test the athletes in the in-competition period. Then the in-competition sample collection process should be changed for in-competition because tests had to be changed. Therefore, however, how the sample collection authority said it cannot be changed. Maybe here, Jack, from what I understood, is that it is difficult to provide here an accurate answer for a specific scenario because that is super specific, and we may not have all the information. However,
I agree. I guess I could touch upon a few high-level bits, but I agree. It sounds like quite a specific case. A sample collection, or sorry, a testing authority, so the organization coordinating the testing and deciding who's being tested, I'm sure would have some kind of rationale, and ultimately it's their decision on if a test goes ahead or not. One aspect in this scenario of testing out a competition the day before and then not testing in comp if the athlete arrives late would be the impact it has on the athlete, their preparation before their competition, stuff like that. There's a few different factors that an anti-doping agency or testing department would consider. Indeed, without knowing the kind of rationale for why they wanted to collect a sample out of competition the day before in the first place, it's hard to then confirm why they would either want to proceed or potentially cancel a test the next day. But one aspect that comes to mind would be the impact on the athlete. If depending on what sport they're doing, what time they're competing in competition, it might just be that we've kind of ran out of an opportunity to do that out of competition test. Yeah.
Okay, and what about just like in general about the changes between in competition and out of competition, just to react to Minwoo question?
Yeah, so I guess an out of competition test is, well, in fact, I'll start with in comp because it's easier. So an in competition test is any test that takes place on an athlete on the day they compete. Well, the window starts at 11:59. Where in fact it can vary from sport to sport. So I would recommend checking the anti-doping rules for your sport. But in general, if the athlete is competing on that day, they are in competition. If it's the day before, then out of competition. And yeah, indeed. So that may influence a sample collection, a testing organization's kind of rationale to to proceed or not proceed with a test if the outcome one wasn't possible.
Great, thank you, Jack. And let me follow up about the next two questions. So the first one is from Luciano. Luciano, who asked, "What if the analysis is incorrect?" But here it's worth mentioning that it is a robust system, but this is more like a legal question. So this is why, Luciano, if you feel free to reach out to us, you are more than welcome to email us at education@ita.sport, where we can follow up with the legal team of the ITA. And the next question from Austin is, what is the relationship between ITA and WADA? So if I may, Jack, I will just briefly respond to this question. So WADA is the global regulator. So WADA sets the rules and ensure compliance. And on the other hand, the ITA implements the rules on behalf of international federations, major event organizers, and other organizations requesting support. So yeah, hopefully, Austin, for you, that was a short but helpful answer to your question. I can see that, yeah, we received very many questions. So the next one from Sebastian, I'll be reading that question, but maybe Jack as well. I don't know if you had time to
Yes,
to have
I've read it, yes.
to have a thing on that. So what is your input on Sebastian's question about that?
Yeah, so they touch upon kind of whereabouts, and if there is no valid address, kind of using tools such as GPS and maybe even like a map to help a doping control officer find you. Ultimately, the main kind of the first point of call should be updating ADAMS in a valid way. In this day and age, providing an accurate address should be possible 99 out of 100 times. But in the circumstances where it's not, they do reference kind of GPS and kind of maps. But essentially, you want to picture yourself being in the shoes of someone who's never been to this location before, in other words, a doping control officer. What information can you give that doping control officer to find you without advance notice? So information such as, I don't know, it's the big red house 2 doors down, or like that kind of information where any kind of identifiable objects or landmarks can be useful information for a doping control officer to help them find you. I've even heard of a case where an athlete actually did a video and sent that in to their NADO, and their NADO could then use that in the future. Kind of just put your mind in the position of a doping control officer who's trying to find you without making a phone call, and what information you can give them to help.
Great, thank you very much, Jack, for explaining a bit more about this one. We have one interesting question from Anna, and yeah, we touched upon DBS. Could actually an athlete require DBS instead of blood test or urine test, for example?
So we do test athletes who have a phobia of needles. There's kind of processes in place where we try and make it as calm and comfortable as possible. A fear of needles wouldn't make them exempt from a traditional blood test. However, you touched upon a great point here. DBS testing is a much more athlete-friendly kind of sample collection technique. And indeed, it could be perfect in this case, where if this athlete we could in theory test this athlete for a DBS instead of a traditional blood test. And potentially in the future, at the moment, as I mentioned with DBS, you can't necessarily detect everything that you would in a venous blood or a blood sample from your vein compared to a DBS sample, but it's an area of growth and development. And maybe in the future, a DBS sample could do everything you could do in a venous blood sample, in which case, yes, this would be a great example where DBS would be better for this particular athlete because it's more accommodating to their fear of needles. So yeah, at the moment, it wouldn't make them exempt of any traditional blood test, but it definitely would be an option that could be applied.
Great, thank you, Jack. And we could see also in the chat that Anna sent us a comment saying thanks for responding to your question. So yeah, you're welcome, Anna, for responding. That we had time to respond to your question. So let's maybe tackle a few more questions as we are running out of time. So the next question from Minwoo is, if the sample collection authority is responsible for recruiting chaperone, but for example, there are not enough chaperone, should the sample collection authority recruit more doping control officers, for example?
So obviously the testing authority, so the organization that is planning the testing, should be doing their kind of preparation in advance and ensuring that there are a suitable number of chaperones and staff for the testing that's required. If there's a scenario where there's not enough, my recommendation and what I personally do from kind of being on site at competitions or from prior experience is go with the approach of, let's ensure the quality and experience for the athlete is the priority. And if we need to, because we don't have enough staff, we potentially reduce testing. Or maybe we stagger it in a way that allows us to do less tests from one particular event, but then we could kind of recycle staff for a second event later on. We kind of find ways of maximizing the staff, but the most important aspect is it's not good practice to start trying to notify 2 athletes at once or anything like that. We always want to try and do one-to-one chaperoning, and the quality and kind of experience for the athlete is the priority. If there's obviously not enough staff, then yeah, raise it and flag it through the proper channels. But if in that specific day and at that moment you don't have enough staff, you need to make a decision whether you do, hypothetically speaking, say you're supposed to do 10 tests, but you don't have enough staff for 10, then you reduce. I always recommend that. I don't encourage people to start trying to push the team to their limit, because that's when issues happen and the athlete experience is diminished.
Great, yeah. So yeah, that's why we try as much as possible that the experience of testing for athletes that they are a great experience for them. So this is where maybe we have a few more questions to cover. The next one from Michelle, I guess you touched upon the responsibility of who's recruiting a chaperone for testing mission, but then it is maybe if you can summarize a bit of the how does the sample collection authority ensure that the DCOs or chaperones are like policy checked?
So there are kind of within the international standards details on kind of the process that a chaperone should follow and the person witnessing the sample should follow. The anti-doping organizations are expected to train and accredit their doping control staff. I guess my recommendation would maybe be that if an athlete is concerned and they find themselves in a situation where they don't feel, always proceed with the test, but if they have concerns, document it, report it, and that anti-doping organization could then kind of put in corrective action if there's a need and follow up and accordingly. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. But I guess hopefully I can emphasize and reassure people that there are standards in place, and chaperones and doping control staff have to meet that criteria, and yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jack. What a wrap up. So I can see that there are still questions in the Q&A, but for time purpose, we're gonna need to wrap up. So that's why for those who submitted your question in the Q&A, or if you have any questions later on, feel free to email us. And that's wrap up today's webinar. Thank you, Jack, for your expertise and your inputs. We hope that you enjoyed the session, and I'm sure that our audience was delighted to have you with us.
Thanks, Dylan. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope everyone found it a informative and fruitful webinar.
Great, thank you, Jack. So yeah, for our audience, feel free to email us at education@ita.sport. Thank you for your attention, active participation, and yeah, we hope that you found this webinar valuable. So see you soon, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.